Chapter 32 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 32. Peggy pleads with Elinor. They were seated alone in Elinor's room. Peggy had thrown off her hat and jacket, while Elinor looked at her again and again, as if to assure herself that it was really her sister. Perhaps she had not yet recovered from the experiences of the day, but she could not understand the look in Peggy's eyes. She had feared that some awful calamity had befallen her. Even now she was afraid of the revelations which might be made to her. That was why she wondered at the look of joy which she saw. "Peggy, tell me," she cried. "I don't know why it was, but I went up to that awful place to see you this afternoon, and the door was locked, and the woman in the next house told me such a horrible story. Tell me, where have you been? What has happened? What is the meaning of it all?" "Don't you know?" cried Peggy. "But of course you don't. How could you? I forgot." And then the child poured out the miserable story of the past few months, told of the things about which she had, in the past, been silent, showed her sister her heart. "I didn't know anything could be so horrible," she sobbed. "Oh, I was mad. I did not understand. I did not realize. But I had not been married to him long before I saw what he was, knew what it was to be the wife of such. You don't know, Elinor. You can't think. But still I fought on. I would not give in. I would not confess that I had made a mistake. I said I would be loyal to him, and all the time, oh, I can't tell you. You know what it was like on that Sunday afternoon, the kind of house, the kind of people. When I got back last night, the place was empty, and that horrid woman told me that Mrs. Barnes and her daughters had gone away, and then she gave me a letter. Here it is. Read it." "And you know no more than this?" asked Elinor after she had read. The child shook her head. "But what did you do? How did you spend the night? Why didn't you come back here?" "I didn't know what to do. I think I was mad. I remember wandering round the streets not knowing where I was going. If I thought anything at all, it was that I would find my way to the river and throw myself in. I did not feel as though I could come to you, somehow. I didn't think you would understand, but I kept on walking, and then suddenly I found myself on Hampstead Heath, and "Yes?" cried Elinor eagerly. "I don't know how it was, but I heard myself saying, 'I will arise and go to my father,' and I found myself at home, and there was a light in the window, and I rushed to the door, and Dad came out and brought me in. Oh, Elinor, Elinor!" "Then you went home?" "I couldn't help it. Do you know what he said to me when he came that morning I told you about? 'The door will be always open to you, Peg,' and his words have remained in my memory ever since." "And they received you kindly?" "Oh, Elinor, you don't know. You can't think how good Dad is, or how beautiful he was. Of course, in a way, I expected that Mother would. But, oh, Dad was just lovely. He took me on his knee, just as he did years ago, and I found myself with my arms round his neck, telling him everything." For a moment a feeling of anger shot into Elinor's heart. A sense of pride rose up within her, a horror of failure. "Then you swallowed your pride?" she found herself saying. "Elinor, what pride had I? What had I to be proud about? Why, as you know, I had been a bad, wicked girl. We both had. and I could not help going home. Oh, if you knew how splendid Dad is! Why, in spite of everything, I went to sleep feeling happy. Just the knowledge that I was in my own bed again, and that I was home, and do you know when Dad came into the room and knelt down by me and said, 'God bless you, my little Peg,' I felt as though, oh, I can't tell you what I felt. It's all been so horrible, and I've been so wicked, but I'm glad I went home." "Then you've gone home to stay?" "Where else could I go? Besides, after all that common, tawdry, shabby vulgarity, to find myself at home where things were beautiful and pure and clean, it was just heaven. I don't know how it was, but last night when I read that letter, something seemed to break, and I saw things as they really were. Oh, how could I have done it, Elinor?" "And you've come from home now?" said her sister, bewildered at what had taken place, and hardly understanding Peggy's incoherent story. "Yes," the child replied, "and do you know, I did not wake until midday today, and it was all so beautiful. And then Trev came home, quite unexpectedly. He isn't going back to Ireland again, and of course it was all so wonderful. You see, Trev's so changed, and then he insisted on bringing Mary Penryn, that's the girl he's engaged to, and I think I forgot everything except my own happiness. All those horrible months seemed as though they never existed, and they were all so good to me, Elinor. Mary Penryn is just lovely. No wonder Trev's fond of her. No one upbraided me, and they've been so kind. Oh, it has all been so wonderful, so horrible, and yet so beautiful. I hardly know what I'm saying. Then Trev mentioned your name, and immediately I felt I must come and tell you. Dad wanted to come with me, but I wouldn't let him. Then John insisted that he would come, but I felt as though it wouldn't be right somehow. I wanted to see you myself, and I told them that I would come alone. And when I got here you were gone, but I wouldn't go away. I knew you would be home some time, so I said I'd wait, and I have waited, you see. I could not help coming for you, dear." "Coming for me?" "Yes, coming for you, for of course you're coming back with me." Eleanor shook her head. "No," she replied, "I can't do that." "But why? They are waiting for you." "How do you know? Did they tell you anything? Oh, you really must come home with me. You must." "And confess myself a failure? No, I won't." "You can't mean that." "Yes, I do." The girl spoke defiantly. "Now I know you are safe, I shall be all right. Perhaps it was right for you to go home. You are different, but I cannot do it." In vain Peggy pleaded with her. Eleanor longed to do what her sister asked. Her heart ached for a sight of her father and mother, but something forbade her. Her pride rose in revolt. She could not go back and confess she had been wrong, for she knew she had been wrong. But to go back and confess it was too humiliating. "Then I suppose I must go without you," said Peggy sadly, "or they will be thinking that something has happened to me, and I did hope you'd come with me." At that moment there was a knock at the door, and a man who was employed by the owner of the flat appeared. "A telephone message for you, miss." "Yes, what is it?" "It's from Miss Honeywood, miss. She phoned to say that her friends at Enfield wanted her to stay the night, and thinking you wouldn't mind, she consented. That's all, miss." "There now," cried Peggy when the man had gone. "You can't stay here after that. Oh, Eleanor, why be lonely and miserable?" "I am not lonely, and I am not miserable," replied the girl. "I have my work to do, and I am going to live my own life. Do you know, Peg, I have got a splendid position, and I shall have all sorts of opportunities for advancement. But it's no use talking. I'm not going back." Peggy made her way to the door. "Good night, dear. Is there any message you would like me to give them at home?" Elinor shook her head. "Shall I ask Trev to bring Mary Penryn here? I know you'd like her." Again she shook her head. "There's nothing you'd like me to say to Dad and Mother, is there?" "No." "Then good night." There was something pathetic in the child's tone, something which appealed to Eleanor strongly. A great weight had been lifted from her heart to know that Peggy was safe, and yet as she realized that her sister's life had been ruined, that the past few months had meant, and must ever mean, an irreparable tragedy in her life, she felt a horrible remorse. It was her fault. Peggy had been greatly under her influence, and had she acted differently, her sister's life might have been saved. But because she had been under the spell of such women as Thames and Corey, and had listened to her unhealthy talk, she had allowed Peggy to go her own way, and this was the result of it. Still, she steeled her heart against her sister's pleading. She could not, no, she simply could not go back to her home after all that had taken place. She opened the door, and Peggy passed out on to the landing. As she did so, a sense of utter desolation swept over her. Peggy would go home, while she would be left there in loneliness. After all, what had she to stay away for? What had she gained by going away? And was not Peggy right? Hadn't she too been a bad girl? Her heart ached with a great hunger. She longed for the life she had forsaken, longed with an unutterable longing. Why should she stay there in loneliness and misery? Besides, it was her duty to go home. At that moment she realized something of what her father and mother must have felt because of her action. Perhaps they had spent sleepless nights thinking about her and Peggy, and she had been careless, indifferent about them. She had thought only of herself, nothing of her duty. "Honour thy father and thy mother." The words came to her mind. All the influences of her early years were at work, all those things which she had learnt when her mother taught her to say her simple prayers. Her innermost soul was calling out for something which she had discarded, forgotten, and yet which was the great secret of life. It all came like a flash, and although it has taken me some time even to suggest her feelings, Peggy had scarcely passed from the door before the truth came to her. "Peggy!" she called, and the word was like a gasp. "Yes, dear, what is it?" I'll go with you. Wait, no, don't say anything. I can't bear it. But wait." Almost feverishly she put on her hat and jacket, and they left St. Hildebrand's Mansions and went into the street. "Dad told me," began Peggy. No, don't speak," interrupted Elinor. There's a taxi." Almost frantically she stopped the driver, who drew up at the curb. Neither of the two girls spoke a word as the taxi made its way towards Hampstead, but Peggy, who had nestled close to her sister's side, sobbed quietly. As for Elinor, she sat perfectly still, gazing with unseeing eyes into the streets. The taxi had barely reached the door of General Trelawney's house when it opened. It might seem as though someone were waiting, listening. "Hello, Peg, you've got back. Splendid!" It was the General's voice. "And you too, Elinor. Splendid! Run in, will you? I'll pay the man." A minute later the General entered the house and saw Elinor standing in the hall alone. He was an understanding man, and knew that what might appeal to Peggy, and for that matter was absolutely necessary to her, would be repugnant to his other girl. The two were entirely different. Peggy was impulsive, emotional, easily moved, quick to manifest her feelings. Elinor, on the other hand, was outwardly cold. She dreaded scenes. She was not given to evidence her feelings. For a few seconds the two stood looking at each other, as if trying to read the other's thoughts. The father saw that his eldest daughter's eyes were hard and defiant, even while they were yearning, saw that she was fighting a great battle, and that a wrong word on his part might do infinite harm. "Elinor, my dear," he said, "I am glad to see you. This is simply splendid. You have just come in time for supper, too." Not a word of reproach, not a suggestion that she had come back as a disobedient child, only a glad welcome, just as though she had been away for a long holiday and had returned. She did not speak. She could not, but she seemed to be waiting for something. What? Neither of them could have told. Then the General, scarcely knowing what he was doing, held out his arms, and the girl, almost as unconsciously, threw herself into them. "Dad," she said, "it's awfully hard for you, but will you forgive me?" "There, there," cried the father. "It's beautiful to see you home again, my dear. Ah, Alice, there you are. Elinor's come just in time for supper." It was all so natural, yet so wonderful. Instinctively she knew what her father felt, knew of the thoughts which were surging through his mind at that moment, realized the nightmare of the last few months, and yet he never hinted at it. He seemed to know by some wonderful wizardry what her feelings were, knew that she could not bear the words which might seem natural under the circumstances. And because she understood, she felt as though a great healing power had passed over her. It was as though the thought of his love, although she felt more than ever her own wrongdoing, brought joy instead of reproach in her homecoming. Yes, Peggy was right. Her father was wonderful, and she knew, as she had never known before, what a daughter's love meant. Somehow the crust which had encased her heart was broken, and the cold pride in which she had rather gloried was melted. How it was she could not tell, but Elinor felt like a new girl. For the first time in years she wanted some manifestation of affection, wanted to hear words of tenderness. "But, Dad," she said, "you'll try to forgive me, won't you? And, oh, I do love you." There was a catch in her voice as she spoke, and the General felt the tears well into his eyes. "But not as much as I love you, dear, not half. But there, it's splendid to have you home." A few minutes later Elinor had recovered herself. She wondered how she could have so given way to her feelings, but she was not a bit ashamed of them. Some strange alchemy had been at work that had changed everything. Then there was Elinor's meeting with her brothers and Mary Penryn. Everything passed off in the most ordinary way. It might seem as though everything had been arranged beforehand, and the General had told his children what they were and were not to say. But this was not so. He simply knew how to lead the conversation into right channels, knew by a kind of instinct and intuition what words ought to be said. Nevertheless, the joy of it all was beyond words. Instinctively the General's mind swept back to that first Sunday night after those long years of absence, and he realized what that night had meant in their lives, realized the antagonism which existed, and how it had embittered the whole of the succeeding months, and must throw a dark shadow upon the future of all of them. but he said no word about it. Words would be worse than useless at such a time. What he felt may be guessed, but cannot be described. "For what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful," repeated the General as they sat down to supper. Old-time words, repeated oft-times without meaning, yet somehow each felt them to be something more than a mere matter of form as they passed his lips. The whole atmosphere of the place was that of thanksgiving and quiet joy. "What do you think of Mary?" asked Trev, who sat next to her at the supper table. "Isn't she fine? I tell you I'm the luckiest beggar in the world. I shall be able to see her nearly every day now. You do like Mary, don't you?" "Of course I do, Trev. She's a dear sweet girl." "I knew you'd say so," cried Trev with all the fervour of a young lover. "I can't get over it, you know." "Get over what?" "What she should see in me. And do you know, things are turning out splendidly too. I was made captain during the war, and then afterwards I went down the scale and had to be contented with being lieutenant. But they are putting me back again." "Back again? What do you mean?" "I'm captain permanently now. Mary's mightily pleased, I can tell you. And as for her father, you must meet the squire. He's just the bluff old chap that one reads about in stories. But he's nothing to Dad. Isn't Dad great? Do you know, when I first saw him, I was awfully proud of him, but "I know," replied Elinor. Oh, how beautiful it was to be among her own people again, to breathe the atmosphere of refinement and understanding. She had felt afraid. All sorts of forebodings had filled her mind. More than once on her way to the house she was on the point of telling the driver to stop. But her father had made the difficult places easy. With his old-fashioned courtesy and his wonderful knowledge, he had made everything so easy for her. She did not deserve it. She knew she did not deserve it. And while his kindness made her past disobedience harder for her to bear, she felt thankful for it. There were only two awkward situations during the whole evening. One was when the clock was striking 10, and she had declared that she must go back to St. Hildebrand's Mansions. "Back to that place, my dear? But why?" asked the General. "Isn't your room ready? Alice, isn't Eleanor's room ready?" "Certainly it is." "Then of course you'll not go back," said the General, as though he took the matter for granted. "But I must get to business to-morrow morning," she urged. "Then go to business from here, my dear." He took her position at Spurling and King's as a matter of course, and whatever he may have felt about it, he offered no opinion. "Do you really want me to stay, Dad?" And she spoke to him in a husky voice. "Want you to stay? Why, Eleanor!" That was all, but it was enough. And Elinor, although she felt everything differently from Peggy, realized that she was at home, and that the old foolish, wicked past was as if it had never taken place. The other awkward situation was when, shortly after 10 o'clock, Rod Ravenscroft was ushered into the room where the family were sitting. Eleanor had expected nothing of the sort, and so when, without warning of any sort, he stood before her, she felt as though she could not speak. Ravenscroft, who had not seen her at first, spoke to Mrs. Trelawney, then to the General, after which his eyes swept quickly round the room. Seeing Peggy, he moved towards her. But no sooner did he catch sight of Eleanor than he stood still, as if not knowing what to do. For a moment an awkward silence prevailed, but the General, with that keen intuition which made him understand what ought to be done, spoke as naturally as if nothing had taken place. "Yes, we're all glad to see you, Rod," he cried. "It's the first time we have all met together since I left home years ago. Isn't it lucky that Trev should be able to come home and find Eleanor and Peg here? I think you have met Miss Penryn. Yes, I see you have. A good job for you that you approve of his engagement. If you hadn't, there would have been pistols for two and coffee for one to-morrow morning. Ah, Trev is a lucky young beggar. Splendid, isn't it?" This speech of the General's gave the two girls time to recover themselves, and enabled Ravenscroft to act naturally. For the next hour, laughter and good feeling abounded. Both the General and Mrs. Trelawney seemed to be as light-hearted as children, while from John's eyes a light shone which told how happy he was. "By the way, John," said Ravenscroft, "I really called in about that patent of yours. It's all right. Nothing like it has been placed on the market, and the patent is as sound as a bell." "Splendid," laughed the General. "What a good thing it is to have a friend who is a lawyer, and especially as he happens to be specializing in patent acts." "It's going to be a great thing, General," said Ravenscroft. "Anyone to look at John wouldn't think he's got it in him, would they?" At this there was general laughter, especially as the boy looked shy and confused. "No use blushing, John," cried the General. "You can't keep it a secret any longer. The engineering world will soon be shaken to its foundations, while motorists everywhere will be talking of Trelawney's non-gear changing invention." "Yes, John's going to be a millionaire," laughed Ravenscroft. "On every hand there will be a demand for the thing, and he's going to have a royalty on every one that's sold. No, John, old chap, I'm not going to tell you how much. Somebody will be telling secrets to the income tax people. Think of John having to pay super tax. You'll have to get married, old chap. I hear there's going to be a big percentage taken off in the case of married men." "Also reduction for each child," shouted Trev. "Look here, John, it isn't fair, old man. Here shall I be, a poor soldier with a captain's pay, while you will be rolling in riches." "And where will the poor barrister come in?" asked Ravenscroft. "No need to trouble about lawyers," retorted John quietly. "They always manage to annex a big share of the booty." But although no apparent notice was taken of the return of Elinor and Peg, the influence of that return was felt by everyone, and Ravenscroft, who did not know of all the circumstances, found himself wondering as to the meaning of what had taken place. Presently, however, just as he was leaving, he had an opportunity to be with Elinor alone. "I want to see you very much," he said. "To see you alone. May I?" "I am at business all through the day," she managed to reply. "Are you going to retain your post?" he stammered. "Certainly," was her reply. "But you leave Spurling and King's at 5:30. You'll be free after that time." "How do you know?" "Never mind that. I know you will be. Shall I find you here to-morrow at 6:30? "Perhaps," and her reply was almost a whisper. "Oh, Elinor," cried Peggy, as the two girls sat alone in the latter's room later. If I'd only known." Her sister was silent. "In a way I'm so happy," sobbed the child, "and yet it's all so ghastly." Still Elinor did not reply. She knew what was in the other's heart. "To think that I ever became the wife of that man! To think that Oh, Elinor, I can't bear it. And I've my life all before me, too. Isn't there some way out of it, I wonder?" "If there is, Dad will find it," was Elinor's reply. "Yes," cried Peggy. "There's always Dad, isn't there? And if he only could, if he only could." End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 33. Love wins out. Rod Ravenscroft had hurried to Duloe immediately after his day's work was over, and found his heart beating wildly as he was ushered into an empty room. "General Trelawney is not yet home, sir," the servant told him. "Neither is Mr. John. Mrs. Trelawney has gone out for a ride with Captain Trelawney and Miss Peggy." "But Miss Trelawney is at home, isn't she?" he asked. "Yes, sir, she came in a few minutes ago." "Will you ask her whether she will see me?" The servant left the room with a meaning smile on her lips. Perhaps she guessed what was in the young fellow's heart. When Elinor entered the room he saw that her face was very pale, and that her eyes had a cold, unnatural look. For a few seconds they regarded each other in silence. It seemed as though neither was able to speak. "I couldn't help coming," Ravenscroft managed to say at length. I wanted to tell you how glad I am, for you have come home for good now, haven't you?" "I don't know," replied Elinor. "But of course you have, and I'm so glad." "But why should you be?" she asked coldly. She had difficulty in restraining her feelings. Her nerves seemed raw. Her whole being was wrought up to an unnatural pitch. Surely you know," was his response. "I'm afraid you give me credit for more knowledge than I possess," was her response. "But I forgot. I want to congratulate you on your engagement." "On my engagement? What engagement?" "I was informed today that you were engaged to Miss Ongar, the only daughter of Mr. Fleming Ongar, K.C., the famous barrister. Did I see you with her on the Heath here some time ago? Ah, I see it was she. Well, I congratulate you." "Your congratulations are premature," was his reply. "Why? Isn't it settled yet?" She was able to speak calmly and coldly now, as though nothing had passed between them. "No, it's not settled," replied Ravenscroft. "Have I spoken too soon? I'm sorry. I was told you were engaged." "I'm not," he replied. But I want to be, Elinor. Don't you understand?" "Understand what?" "There's only one girl in the world I can become engaged to, and her name is not Ongar. I want to be engaged to her. I mean to be too, if she'll have me. That's why I am so glad you have come home. Don't you understand?" Elinor was silent. Something rose up within her which seemed to destroy all power of speech, but there was a glad look in her eyes. "I don't know who told you such a silly story," went on Ravenscroft. "I never thought of Miss Ongar in such a connection. How could I? There's only one girl in all the world for me, and her name is Elinor Trelawney. Can't we begin again where we broke off, nearly a year ago?" I don't understand." "Oh, yes, you do. That's why I'm so glad, and more than glad, that you have come home. It's been a nightmare, hasn't it? I was horribly pained, but I couldn't help loving you all the same. I say, can't we begin again?" "But how can we when "Everything is possible now, Elinor, if you love me," pleaded the young fellow. "Everything. If you had stayed away, nothing could have been possible. But now you've come home. I say, I know I'm a bungling fool. I was months ago, just before you left home. But I do love you, and I say, tell me I'm not mistaken. Tell me I haven't been thinking what can't be. For I want you, my dear. I want you. Heaven only knows how much." Her heart was throbbing wildly, throbbing with joy such as she had never felt before. But that awful night," she began to stammer. Yes, yes, I know all about that. That's nothing. You can tell me as much or as little as you please about that. I know that was only a part of the foolish business of your leaving home, but that never really troubled me. I always knew you were not that kind of girl." "Did you? You're sure?" "Of course I did." "Oh, I am ashamed," cried the girl. "I must have been mad. No, no, I'm not afraid to tell you everything about it. Thank heaven you were in time to see me back safely," she ended tamely. And you care for me, dear?" There was a tremor in his voice. She nodded her head. "Yes, yes, but that way. I want to hear you say so." "Yes," was her reply. "But oh, I shall never forgive myself, never." "For what?" "For my madness, for my disobedience to my father. It's made everything impossible." "No, no," laughed Ravenscroft. "Nothing is impossible now." "But it is. No, I've done nothing wrong, and yet somehow I feel my life has been sullied, as though I'm not worthy of anything beautiful and good." "But you love me? Tell me that again." "Yes, I love you." "Then you'll marry me?" "No, no, I can't. At least, not for a long time. I feel as though I am not worthy, as though I must atone." "Atone be hanged!" almost shouted Ravenscroft. There, there, I've got you now. All that mad business is over. It's all over. We're going to begin anew. You have come back home, and we are engaged, you see? No, it's no use your trying to get away. I've got you. We're engaged. You have promised to marry me, and it will have to be soon." "But I couldn't. I must keep my place at Spurling and King's." "Hang Spurling and King!" laughed Ravenscroft. "They will understand. I know Mr. Spurling well. He's a grand old chap, and when I tell him, he'll understand all about it. I could not tell you before, but I got you that place, Elinor, and now I'm going to take you away from it. You are going to be my wife, do you see? I've told the General all about it, and Little by little Eleanor yielded to her heart's promptings, and as one explanation followed another, both the man and the girl entered into that joy which, although it may be the lot of all, is ever new, ever wonderful. "Yes," said the General late that same night, after Ravenscroft had gone back to his home and Trev had returned with Mary Penryn to Kensington. "It seems as though my heart is full, Alice. I never expected such joy to come to me." "It's very wonderful, isn't it?" said Mrs. Trelawney. "Oh, Lester, it seems as though the last few months have been a ghastly nightmare, and we have woken up to find it was only a dream." "In a way," assented the General. "In a way, yes. We have a great deal to be thankful for, and I trust I am thankful. Perhaps I needed all this to make me understand. Perhaps I, too, was forgetting the deep things of life. But it's wonderful. Fancy John turning out a genius, for I'm sure that invention of his will be a success. Bless the boy, I am proud of him. He has been a world of comfort to me, and to you too, Alice." "He has indeed. I don't know what I should have done without him during those dark days. And Trev, too. Trev has become wonderfully changed, hasn't he? What a good girl will do for a young fellow. And he seems so happy, too." "Who wouldn't be with such a girl as he's got?" laughed the General. "Were you surprised," said Mrs. Trelawney, "about Elinor and Ravenscroft?" "Surprised? Not a bit. I knew it all along. Oh, at one time I was terribly afraid. It's come out all right, though. He told me about it to-night. Elinor insists that she'll go to Spurling and King's for the remainder of the week, but he tells me he has persuaded her to give notice at once. I'm perfectly happy about her now. I had a long talk with them both. I had no idea she was really so affectionate. Oh, God has been very good to us. If only little Peggy were, and Mrs. Trelawney's words ended in a sob. Yes, yes, I know, said the General sadly. Nothing can undo the past as far as Peggy is concerned, and it's a terrible business. Her life will be frightfully saddened, no matter what we may do. I cannot save her from the results of her madness. But Peggy's really a better girl now, and in a way is much happier than she was before. Yes, I believe she is, assented the mother. But, oh, my dear, it's awful to think about. She's only 19, and can't we do something, Lester? Of course I've learnt all about him. There will be no difficulty whatever in getting a divorce. The fellow is not only a bounder and a poisonous creature, but he has openly admitted to me to-day before witnesses that he has given Peggy the right to demand her complete freedom from him. Indeed, he wants it, and boasted to me that within 3 days of his freedom he would marry the woman for whom he gave up Peggy. Just think of it. I had difficulty in restraining myself, difficulty to keep my hands from him. But there, we'll get rid of him with as little publicity as possible, and then Peggy will be free. Perhaps, who knows? There may be a happy future for her after all." "I pray God there may be," sobbed his wife. "Oh, yes," and the General spoke cheerfully, "and please God there shall be, if love can make it so. My little Peg shall be happy, and thank God for it, Alice. None of the children were ever so near to us as they are now. Never did they love us so much." "No," replied Mrs. Trelawney, "and knowing that, I am happy in spite of everything." End of chapter 33. End of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking.